So, Doug, thanks firstly for coming on the podcast because actually, how I saw what Circular was doing, and I think I'd seen a little bit of you popping up on LinkedIn, and then I saw the digital procurement world uh, listings and things like that, and it's a really good way for me to find really cool guests of people doing really cool stuff, and I'm sure they won't mind me using it in that way. And I thought it'd be cool just to get you on, and firstly, just to hear a background into how you maybe came to found Circular and what you were doing before. So,
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And I really appreciate you reaching out. I apologize that now you connected to me on LinkedIn, you'll get spammed with lots and lots of stuff about what we're doing around the place.
I've loved it. I've literally been honestly, I've been saving, and this is a testament to actually how good your content is as a company. I've been screenshotting the post from Circular, like, oh, that's an interesting thing. I've not come across that. I think one of them was, is it Mica? M-I-C-A?
Mica.
I don't even know what this is. So I screenshot it to look into it.
Well, Mica is actually, it's all over the place. Mica is what makes pearlescent paint on the car shimmery. Wow. It's what makes makeup shimmer. So you'll find mica in, for example, everything from lipstick to face powders to paint. But actually, more importantly, mica is also now used as a cheap heat barrier within electric vehicles. You might remember news a few years ago of Teslas catching fire on the side of the road, and that's because the enormous heat created by a battery in use, and actually electric car manufacturers now use mica paper, which is essentially very thin sheets of scrap mica that have been rolled as a form of heat insulation. It's a very, very efficient heat insulation. The problem, though, is that it comes with real responsible sourcing concerns. Quite a lot of the world's mica comes from places like Madagascar, where it is a form of subsistence mining involving, for example, child labor, and that's clearly not good for anybody in their brand. No. So anyway, sorry to disappear off straight into rewind 3 steps and tell you a little bit about who I am and what we do, and then maybe what I've just talked about might make some sense. So I'm Doug Johnson-Poensgen, and I'm co-founder and chief exec of Circular. Circular has been around for about 4 years or so, and we use a combination of technologies to digitize the supply chain to tier N in order to help with a number of particular concerns of our customers. One is responsible sourcing, which we've just touched on in the context of Mica, but also relevant, for example, in the auto sector would be things like cobalt. 63% of the world's cobalt comes from the Congo, which has all sorts of concerns with corruption and child labor and funding of armed groups, and all the worst practices that you could possibly imagine. Or we could be talking about lithium from the Atacama Desert causing, water shortages and making it less and less habitable over time. So responsible sourcing is one of the drivers of digitizing the supply chain and being able to understand where stuff has come from. And the second one, which is driving the growth of our business, probably slightly more than that, which is what we started the business doing, is actually trying to understand the full scope 3 emissions in carbon emissions in a supply chain. If you take, I'm going to talk a little bit about electric cars, but if you take an electric vehicle, we all assume they're better for the planet. And obviously the tailpipe emissions in life are much, much lower. But the total energy invested in manufacturing electric vehicle is way, way higher than a petrol or diesel car. And what that means is that the challenge has shifted firmly onto the car manufacturer, not only to reduce the carbon footprint of their own operations, their own manufacturing plants, but also the supply chain. The battery, the EV battery, accounts for half of the whole supply chain's contribution. Wow. Massively polluting. So at the point at which you pick up the keys to your new EV, you've actually got a significant carbon deficit, which you have to make up through sustainable driving. And so as car manufacturers commit to net zero targets in the late 2030s, 2040 timescale, they need to understand the contribution of the supply chain to those carbon emissions, and then use, for example, procurement as a key driver of reducing that carbon footprint, i.e. buying from more sustainable sources, working with their tier 1 suppliers to specify lower carbon routes through the supply chain, for example. Anyway, sorry, I've covered quite a lot of ground there, but hopefully that gives you a flavor of what we do. And our customers today range from car manufacturers like Jaguar Landrover, Volvo, Daimler, Polestar. Polestar is actually just committed to
I saw
creating the first net zero car by 2030, which is a massive challenge given what I've just told you about electric vehicles. To, in aerospace, the likes of Boeing and also some very large consumer electronics companies, all of which are grappling with things like traceability of critical materials in battery supply chains, as well as sustainability.
Yeah, that's an awesome introduction, by the way. And I mean, I there's a few bits I want to explore from what you've just said. Firstly, though, like, how did you come up with this idea to co-found this? Did you just see a gap in the market? Like,
it sounds kind of. All these things now, obviously, I'm going to now post-rationalize this as genius, but clearly it wasn't. The reality is there's a large amount of luck that comes into play in seizing on an idea that may have legs that you are able to somehow bring to life and convince customers you want to buy. So with that health warning, now let me tell you how the genius worked. So I actually took a week off work in 2017 because I'd been, I was really interested in, blockchain and obviously 2017 was peak hype in terms of cryptocurrencies and things. And my whole background has been in enterprise technology. And I was thinking, interesting technology, where might there be use cases beyond cryptocurrencies in the sort of, inverted commas, real world? And I started looking at some of the fundamental attributes of distributed ledgers and thinking, where might something like this, possibly linked together with other technologies, help solve some real world challenges? That was the germ of the idea, actually responsible sourcing of cobalt used by car manufacturers in EV batteries. And I thought, look, if I want to try and create a business that's going to grow in value, if I can find a market that's, I don't have to explain to venture capitalists that this thing's going to be a hockey stick, the market I'm trying to serve, all I have to demonstrate is that I might be able to follow that trajectory over time. Now, that sounds super easy to say, but it's an awful lot harder to do. And if you ask me, we just closed a large funding round, and I have to say I find the process of raising money from VCs unbelievably painful, particularly if you're a sustainability technology business, which is in a sector that is perceived to be hot. The amount of pitching you have to do to people who approach you saying, "Oh, we like what you're doing," the number of frogs you're kissing, and then trying to whittle that down. We are massively oversubscribed for what we were looking to raise, and then going through the tyranny of multiple sets of lawyers all having to go at you at the same time, it's painful. So if you'd asked me a few weeks ago, was it all worth the effort? I'd have said absolutely not, because I was tearing my hair out with all the lawyers. Now, of course, now we've got the money in the bank, it feels like we're back onto the real mission, which is trying to make a difference in the world.
No, that's great. Yeah. Actually, you kind of just touched on one point that I was going to ask you at some point if I had time, but it makes sense now. So is your technology underpinned by blockchain, so a ledger technology?
Yeah. So we use a combination of traditional databases, a blockchain. We use Hyperledger Fabric, which is Hyperledger is a project of the Linux Foundation, so an open source permissioned ledger, and things like machine learning and AI combined to try and create a reliable digital twin for a commodity at its source, and to follow that commodity through the supply chain to dynamically attribute data to that flow of materials, such as, for example, scope 1 and 2 emissions from each participant in a supply chain, so that it aggregates up over time. Of itself, I'm actually a bit of a skeptic about blockchain. I know we've been through that period where blockchain was the answer to everything, including world peace and world hunger. But in my view at least, one of the really prime use cases for a distributed ledger is in an environment where you have multiple actors, where there's potentially significant asymmetry of resources and information, and you need to be able to try and create trust over an extended period of time. And if you take a material coming out of a mine site in the Congo, it can take 6 months before that becomes a battery that goes into a car. And the people who are mining or smelting or refining have no idea where their product will go. So and yet there are real risks that need to be managed and a real lack of trust within these sort of supply chains. For those that are not nerds on cobalt, think of blood diamonds, same problem. The difference, of course, is that a diamond is a diamond at a mine site, and it's still a diamond when it's cut and polished, put into a piece of jewelry, where in this case, you're talking about cobalt ore that undergoes fundamental transformation through smelting and refining, and it's amalgamated with other materials and eventually finds its way and becomes a car, which is clearly obviously not what got dug out of the ground. And so there's an additional level of complexity, which is where things like machine learning come into it to try and identify anomalies. But supply chain is now, I think, broadly recognized as a sensible use case for a distributed ledger. But a distributed ledger is an inefficient database. There are many things you can do better in a database than you can do in a distributed ledger. Complex business logic, for example, better done in a database than it might be in a distributed ledger. So we use the distributed ledger predominantly for the notarization of transactions through that passage of materials through the supply chain, and thereby giving the benefit of immutability to history. You clearly can't overwrite history if it subsequently proves to be inconvenient, particularly when you're talking about multiple steps in the supply chain. And that's how you create trust. That's the contribution that a distributed ledger or a blockchain brings to the supply chain context.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I did a little consulting stint at an aerospace company, and we were sourcing material to go under the wing of a plane to build some stuff. And the question that was coming up was, where is this material from? And there was no visibility within that entire supply chain. And we were very much reliant, and we were just discussing this before we recorded, on the tier one suppliers having that knowledge and flowing down the contractual conditions to say, you need to know where everything's coming from and flow that information back up. That's crazy inefficient in my eyes, and it didn't work. So I can see this case here.
I think this touches on the changing role of procurement professionals. Certainly with our clients who are, for example, car manufacturers, core procurement is evolving more into supply chain management. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first is, you can't do responsible sourcing just by sending a questionnaire to your tier one supplier. Where has your palm oil come from? Has it been the source of deforestation? How much child labor do you have in your supply chain? What about your conflict minerals? And that's not something that's best done by spreadsheet. Although today, our biggest competitor, Circulor, is the status quo, which is largely the spreadsheet. Yeah. First of all, better understanding what's going on in your supply chain is increasingly important to, basic compliance and risk management tasks like responsible sourcing of conflict minerals. But if you're committing to a net zero target, you can't manage something you can't measure. And that means that if the supply chain is a significant contributor to what you do, auto manufacturing we've talked about, but we could be talking about the construction industry. Cement, by definition, in its manufacture, drives off CO2. And so, you can have cement produced in plants that capture that CO2 or not. And if you want, sustainable cement, well, then where did it come from? And can you prove it? The same would apply to steel used in, for example, the manufacture of onshore wind farms. But there's no point having unsustainably produced steel, which has more carbon emissions than you're ever going to be able to offset by the wind power that you generate. So we've got, as society as a whole, we've got a real challenge around trying to get a grip of the supply chain's contribution to the things that we consume or use. Boris Johnson talks about, the fact that only electric vehicles will be available by 2030. Well, that's laudable at a superficial level. Ignore for a second some of the practical challenges of where on earth we're all going to charge these things and how we're going to generate enough sustainable electricity for that to make a difference. But what about the supply chain's contribution to the manufacture of all of these things? And by the way, where on earth are the critical raw materials like cobalt and lithium going to come from in sufficient quantities to make that even feasible? So, nice headline, extremely challenging in practice. And all of this ultimately comes down to procurement professionals who now have to be able to look to tier N in a supply chain and understand how to manage these risks, or to measure things like, embedded carbon, and find a way to try and engage in a dialogue with tier 1 suppliers about finding more sustainable routes through supply chains. And that will drive real change in global emissions.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I was just thinking there, like your concept there of the biggest challenge to you is that status quo of people doing that. Almost, it's superficial, isn't it? And I've been having conversations about this, like how do we start, and it's not just around this, it's about diversity and things like that as well. Everything's very superficial. There's so and we were talking about why I set up the podcast a little bit beforehand, and I said I just didn't like the content mostly in this space. But a lot of the content we see in the space around like sustainability and all of these drives is so macro, it's so superficial. It doesn't go into the detail. Like I've already learned way more just talking to you in 5 minutes than I've learned from every news headline. And I guess with technologies like yours, it's, and you say it's the building of trust. It's almost being able to point to something and say, we've got visibility of every step within our supply chain. That's the proof there. And so when we are building out these new products, these new infrastructures, like you say, we could put all this stuff in for, I guess, like charging points for cars all around the country. But is that going to be offset everything else? Is that going to be, are we going to be able to offset that? And at the moment, I guess we would be guessing. Even I just don't know how people are going to point to someone and say, yeah, we know for definite that we've done a good thing here. We might well not be on the right track.
Yeah, I mean, just bring it back to procurement professionals for a second. There are some real visionaries in this space. I mean, our first large customer was Volvo Cars, and their chief procurement officer, Martina, so she's just finished at Volvo Cars, Martina Buchhauser, who was running procurement at Volvo Cars, took sustainability on board, really took it to heart, and actually started to move the whole of the traditional procurement organization in a car manufacturer, which is a big buying operation, and make sustainability as important a buying criteria as price and quality. Wow. And actually, I heard her say that to their supplier conference, Christmas 2019, that from now on, sustainability would rank in their consideration alongside price and quality. Wow. That's a pretty big statement. She's not the only one. I mean, there's a guy called David Owen at Jaguar Landrover who's trying to drive something similar into Jaguar Landrover. And it's people like that who are fundamentally changing the role of procurement as a key driver of sustainability in very, very big organizations in polluting industries. And we need more of them. And we need others to learn from those lessons and seek to improve on it and in their own organizations.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because when I've seen RFPs go out with evaluation criterias, things like that get such a token scoring amount. And you're right, like the 2.5% allocation of the overall score, or however they're doing it, really, like there's no incentive on the supply chain to even react to that. And I know typically we're talking about sort of tier 1 suppliers there, but because the tier 1 suppliers don't have to do much, they don't need to pass anything down through the supply chain, I guess, as well.
Let me give you a practical example. I mean, Volvo Cars went through an extensive exercise to select its battery manufacturers for its EVs. And they made traceability a core requirement of those contracts. And they eventually let the contracts to 2 companies, LG Chem, LG as in the electronics company, and CATL, which is probably the world's largest EV battery manufacturer. And essentially that requirement for traceability, whether it is to demonstrate responsible sourcing or to help drive greater sustainability in the manufacture of batteries, is a core cornerstone of those contracts. And of course, the battery manufacturers, the tier 1, now flow that obligation down their supply chain to their tier 1s, who flow it down to their tier 1s. Yeah,
that's it.
And that's how you change an industry. And by making it a core requirement that notwithstanding price, quality, and all the other things, demand forecasting, and capacity, et cetera, sustainability or traceability is a core part of what it is you are going to buy, because you're serious about your targets.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly powerful. And I think, the message is procurement need to to adopt and change the sort of the status quo around us. And then your supply chain will have no choice, I guess, but to follow. Especially, I think you're right that you pulled out two examples there of very big companies in the sector. Like if they shift, everyone kind of has to shift around them. And I don't think that should be an excuse though for the smaller ones, right? Like
No.
they shouldn't just be like, oh, we don't have as much influence as some of these bigger companies. The CPOs, head of procurement, whoever it is, they can have just as much of an impact, especially when you add all of that, compound all that together.
Absolutely right. The more demanding that the end customers are of their suppliers, whether it be price or quality or sustainability or whatever, the more you change industries. And particularly in very polluting industries. I briefly touched on construction earlier, whether it's green steel or green cement is one example. But actually, if you think about building refurbishment and the amount of waste that goes into landfill, rather than is recycled, or in the construction of buildings, how many buildings today are designed with the circular economy in mind? The answer is not many, and it's extremely expensive. And yet this has to become commonplace. I mean, we have in the UK, of course, news now that the government is looking to have every householder retrofit or take out their gas central heating boiler and replace it with something like a heat pump. Laudable, obviously likely to require significant government subsidy, but that should also be an opportunity to force the manufacturers of heat pumps and all the other new technologies we're going to use to heat our homes, to manufacture whatever those things are more sustainably, so that the lifetime contribution of a more sustainable way of heating your home is not undermined by the enormous supply chain cost in environmental terms of manufacturing this stuff.
Yeah, no, they're great points, and I think a good message that you've shared here so far is, a lot of these points, especially when they're government initiatives, they're very laudable, right? They sound very good, but when you get into the detail, have they really been that well thought out? Maybe not, but it maybe is a step in the right direction. I really like the example you just used. Funny enough, I did a little stint working at in one defense area, and we were actually responsible for new build houses. It sounds weird, right? Like defense, new build houses, sending off land, had contractors like Taylor Wimpey and everyone like that. And we were already forcing those providers to stop with the gas boilers from 2023 just to get ready for all of this. But when I think back to how are we tracking that? How are we tracing everything they're doing? How are we measuring them? The answer is they're not being measured in any way. It's very superficial. It's a single contract clause as a requirement in the contract, but that's it. And I guess therefore they're going to just do this in the cheapest way possible, which might not necessarily always be the most efficient. I might not be using the right terminology here as a
I think you're absolutely right.
Area.
I think you're absolutely right. We've got to mean it. I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, we're talking quite a bit about carbon emissions, but a year and a bit ago, all of us stopped traveling. We all went into various forms of lockdown, and global carbon emissions fell by about 5%. Well, why so little? Well, by the way, 5% is roughly what the Paris Accord requires every year, cumulatively. Right. And of course, we weren't flying places, and that has a contribution, and we weren't driving very much, and that has a contribution, but we're all sitting at home and using our central heating and electricity and all the rest of it. But we're also still buying stuff, and buying stuff, of course, means that global supply chains are still doing everything they do. And that's why carbon emissions didn't fall very much. And actually, if you think about how radical putting everyone into lockdown was, and what the effect of it was on global carbon emissions, and you think you have to achieve that every year, we've got some big changes to make. And I'm not a placard waving headbanger for the environment, but it's, I can see how better understanding the impact that we as consumers have in who we buy from, and that those organizations who are managing things actually have real sway over their suppliers and how they act more sustainably. Combined, that can make a very sizable difference.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like I've seen some commentary on it where providers of whatever it is, let's just call it material goods, whether it's clothing from, let's think of some UK shops, Boohoo, ASOS, whatever. If they get to a point where they can display on the product page, all the stats, where the fabrics come from, where it was made in detail, we're going to have a far more aware buy-in society like that. And I guess your technology and things like that could be a way to open up some of those points.
I mean, the digitization of the supply chain and understanding where stuff has come from, what the recycled content is, what the, how much carbon was emitted in its manufacture, how much water was used, very relevant to things like, for example, cotton. Most people don't realize the enormous amount of water that goes into the growing of cotton. Quite apart from, the forced or child labor that goes into picking it in some of the former Russian republics. So, there are many things that we as consumers would be horrified about in our collective desire for stuff, but that we just don't have visibility into.
Yeah, I think, you're right. Like, I think we would be horrified at what our buy-in decisions have allowed, and we're probably all very much guilty of it, especially all across the world. So it's a really good point to raise. And Doug, I'm very conscious of time. I want to direct people to you here. Like, where is the best place people? It's probably going to be your website. Whether there's a specific link we can include in like the show notes description, we can sort that out. But where can people find you, find out more about what you're up to at Circulor?
Yeah, I mean, yes, our website's a good start, www.circulor.com. And there's contact forms and stuff there. We currently work predominantly in industrial supply chains, whether it's car manufacturers or others. So heavily polluting industries where there are complex industrial supply chains, where there's a growing drive both in terms of consumer demand for more sustainable and responsible business practices, but also institutional investors, whether they are lenders or shareholders, starting to require meaningful evidence of ESG, environmental, social, and governance performance from brands, which makes what we've been talking about in this podcast a real boardroom issue. It's taking a while sometimes for that boardroom discussion to trickle down into new ways of working inside certainly very large organizations. But 5 years ago, sustainability was not top of mind. I think we all recognize now that it is. Greater visibility of supply chains is right up there for folks. Look at the auto industry at the moment and the global semiconductor shortage. The only way to solve that is to get a better understanding of the risks within the supply chain, and to better forecast demand further out, and in order to secure supply. There are some car manufacturers that are actually stopping the production of certain models simply because they don't have that level of visibility into the supply chain. I've said this theme a number of times. I think the role of the procurement officer is moving into one of managing a supply chain. If you're at the downstream end of a supply chain, you need to be able to see past your tier one supplier in order to understand the key risks that will shape the future of your business.
Yeah, no, I honestly, Doug, this has been insane to talk to you. I can already tell right now this has been one of the best podcasts we've had. You just dropped so much knowledge, which is really good, and it's innovative. I want to avoid using the word trending, because trending feels like it's going to go away, and I don't think this will. And if it does,
I've never trended at anything, but
no, I think you're trending.
Thank you.
It's been great to have you on here, Doug. I think people are going to learn a lot from this. I certainly have, and thanks for your time today.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for inviting me.